It's been said in the past that wars are won as much in the factories as on the battlefield, that at their heart they're often a test of will and logistics. In Ukraine, territory often changes hands very, very slowly. But with every day that passes, a critical attritional struggle is playing out. One where both sides batter away at each other, hoping to break down their capacity to continue the fight. Capacity which, in a war like this one, is very closely tied to the availability of munitions and all sorts of war material. So if you're trying to predict how long the Russian military can carry on the fight for, or how it's likely to evolve over time, a good place to start is asking the question, how well can the Russian defense industry answer the military's need for continued resupply? On one hand, you see claims that Russian defense industrial production is more than sufficient to keep this up basically forever, until the will of Ukraine or its allies ultimately cracks. Now, of course, that doesn't explain why Russia is rolling out older and older hardware, and why the age difference between the newest and oldest Russian tanks now in active service is so wide that it'd probably be too much even for Leonardo DiCaprio. But it is the line put forward by people like Medvedev. At the other extreme, there are claims that Russia is constantly running on empty, and that any day now Private Conscriptovich will be down to defending his trench system using nothing but his bayonet. And so today, more than a year and a half into this invasion, we're going to try and solve a mystery. Asking what the Russian war economy actually looks like, how effectively have they mobilized new production, can Russian factories keep up with the ravenous demand of the Russian military for new equipment and munitions, and what might all that mean for the war to come? I hope you're all ready for some data diving. Let's get into it. Now, given the difficulty of assessing Russian defense production, I'm going to treat this a bit like a murder mystery and come at it from different directions. Firstly, we'll look at data and statements being put out by the Russians themselves. Namely, what the politicians are saying in public about production figures on one hand, and then three sets of Russian data. The Russian defense budget, which gives us a clue as to how much the Russian government is spending on new military equipment, Russian corporate data, which shows how much they're earning building military equipment, and Rostec manufacturing indices, which are meant to be measurements of how much stuff the country's manufacturing sector is actually producing. However then, because there might be a possibility that Russian official data may not represent the whole entire and unvarnished truth, we're then going to look at updated open source loss data to see what equipment Russian units might be receiving and losing, and what that might say about production levels. Having established that those production levels across most systems are nowhere near adequate to keep up with attrition, I'm then going to look specifically at one exception, which is the Russian production of small drones and loitering munitions, before ultimately bringing all of this together and trying to offer some sort of assessment. Is Russian production up to the challenge? How might the Russian military evolve from this point going forward? And what that means for the wider war. Okay, so how might we go about evaluating changes in Russian defense production? Unsurprisingly, this can be pretty difficult. Given the nature of the Russian system and the way it encourages corruption and deception, it's possible that even quite senior Russian leadership don't know the exact figures. I didn't end up taking the step of asking the Russian MOD for a spreadsheet outlining major system production since February 2022, but I doubt they would have been forthcoming. But what we can do, like many good investigations, is try and stitch together the different evidence available to us. Looking at what Russia says they're spending, corporations say they're earning, and Rostec says they're all producing. And as we go through them, we can look for contradictions, corroboration, or clues. And so to start with, we're just going to look at statements by Russian senior leaders, which, if you were thinking about this as a murder mystery, for example, is basically the stage where you just interrogate the suspect. Because defense production in Russia is often shrouded in official secrecy, and so obviously senior politicians regularly talk about it publicly. Often we'll see reporting like this by Russian state media covering some of those declarations. This one was by Vladimir Atyakov, who is a senior leader at Rostec, Russia's defense production megacorp. And he gives us a figure, potentially useful, saying that Russia has quadrupled armoured vehicle production over the course of a year. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean we can just take the pre-invasion production levels we know about, multiply them by 4 and call that our new estimate. For one, Atyakov could be mistaken or lying. Secondly, the statement is also quite vague. It doesn't specify what it means by production. Is that just entirely new vehicles? Is it modernised vehicles? Is it repaired vehicles? Is it reactivated vehicles, etc.? You might even be able to read a little bit of shade on the vagueness issue in this article here, where directly after the quote saying production has increased 4 times over, TASS chooses to include the sentence, quote, "He did not give the number of produced armoured vehicles," end quote. To which I'd add, if we were given a figure, we'd probably be able to backward engineer what the claim actually related to. And this highlights one of a couple of broader problems with using these sort of common Russian declarations of massive increases in defence production. The first is that the statements are often vague or contradictory. Contradictory in the sense that they clash with other things that official Russian sources are telling us. One of the big examples here might be the clash between claimed production figures and a relatively small claimed increase in the defence budget, which we'll talk about a bit later. That's just one example, but the broader reality seems to be the Russian government doesn't really have its story straight on a lot of the details of its claimed defence production numbers. The second problem, as I said, is vagueness. Now, I know it must be shocking to accuse politicians of being vague, but often you'll see these statements looking like they contain very useful information while actually being very uncertain. For example, Putin has made a statement that Russia has increased its production tenfold in the most in-demand areas. But in-demand areas could mean anything from Iskander missiles to sharpened entrenching tools. It also doesn't explain what on earth production or output is meant to actually mean. Is it referring to a count of individual items? Well, that doesn't make sense if you include multiple systems in the same category, does it? If tank production falls by 100, but assault rifle production increases by 101, sure, I might be able to say that I have increased weapon production overall. But it's probably not going to be much comfort to my tank crews when I tell them about their new job as trench clearers. Alternatively, the Russians might be valuing things in terms of financial output, how much the weapons are worth. But in that case, inflation and currency devaluation would appear to be an increase in output. If the ruble loses 50% of its value, sanctions come in to cut off your access to imported components, and you have to use increasing amounts of overtime and unskilled labour in your factories to make up capacity, all of which is less efficient than your original trained manpower, then all else equal, that'll probably translate into higher per-unit sticker prices, which will appear as increased production. It's not technically untrue, but it also might be deceptive. It would suggest that one of the fastest ways to increase production is to get worse at building things cheaply. Another reason these figures can be hard to use is they're often expressed in percentage terms, which isn't really useful to you if you don't know the baseline. I've got a quote there by another leadership figure at Rostec saying that over the past year, Kalashnikov has increased small arms production by 40%, while production of missiles like Vikir have increased by 1.5 times. But if you don't know what figure is being increased or decreased, you don't know how significant that production is. 40% more Kalashnikovs is a lot of guns. But a 150% increase in production of the Vikir, the 9K121 for example, might mean, depending on what source you read, an increase of maybe 300 to 500 missiles per year, which is still something that Ukraine would definitely notice, but not exactly war-changing. If you want an example of a relevant baseline, the existing 2022-23 contract for the production of the Kar-52 helicopter was for 30 units over 2 years, 15 per annum. Which means just to keep up with the visually confirmed losses in Ukraine, so no undocumented losses, no losses to wear and tear, Rostec would have to roughly double the contracted production rate just to stay even. The figures for niche products can get pretty low. The NK-32 engines that go on the Tupolev 160 strategic bomber, for example, are produced at a massive rate of 4 per year. So the Russians might think twice before putting serious operating hours on the engines that are already in service. In other cases, claims might not be vague per se, they're just made by Dmitry Medvedev and as a result completely divorced from reality. Medvedev is one of Russia's leading exporters for several key commodities: apocalyptic nuclear threats, saber rattling, and of course massive projections for Russian defense production. He's actually on record saying that Russian factories are turning out more weapons than the military actually needs, which I presume means that Russia has lowered its rate of artillery fire in Ukraine not because it has any prospect of being short of artillery shells, but rather because they simply want to give the Ukrainians a fair chance or something. Now sift through it all and you can get some potentially useful snippets. You can find top-level figures like Putin's 2.7 time multiplier for current defense production. Other examples might be Medvedev's claim of a many-fold increase in Russian defense production, or simply that industry is producing more weapons than the military actually needs. And all sorts of others besides, but I'll stick with that 2.7 time multiplier since it comes from Putin through a lot of this presentation. You could look at old production reporting pre-February 2022 when things were not so tightly classified, and also sift through individual reports on, say, deliveries from individual plants since the full-scale invasion. A French organisation, for example, looked at some of those sources around Russian tank production and was able to conclude that pre-invasion tank production, both of modernisations and new chassis, peaked in 2014, after which sanctions and other factors drove production to fall. If you're interested in what sort of final projection those French researchers came up with, their estimate for annual reactivation and new production now is a bit short of 900 vehicles per annum, of which less than 200 are new builds and 700 are reactivations. Those are a bit different to the figures I would put forward, but it is a good illustration of how this process can work. But the reality here is kind of like interviewing a suspect or a witness. The information we're getting here is ultimately pretty vague and unreliable. And so what we need is probably less public claims and testimony, and instead, in the finest traditions of investigators everywhere, to instead follow the money. So I'm about to talk about what is no doubt everyone's favourite topic on YouTube: budgets, production indexes, and corporate reporting. That's important because Russian soldiers and Russian factory workers ultimately do not work for free. And so the Russian defence budget can serve as a sort of soft proxy for overall defence production levels. We can marry that with other data sources on things like earning and output and see what we find. Now, of course, there is a risk that all the data we're about to look at could be completely fabricated, but here's the reason for looking at multiple sources. All else being equal, it might be a pretty simple thing to fabricate an individual report, an individual figure. A corporate fraudster might discover that it's very easy to make profits for a given year look better than they are by simply going in and changing the profit number. But as many financial fraudsters later discover, it's very difficult to fake all the numbers in a way that is internally consistent. If you're generating fake production, you probably need to generate fake employees, fake expenses and incomes for the corporations involved, fake electricity and resource consumption, the list goes on. It's easy to lie to some people some of the time, it's hard to Enron everyone forever. If we look at the official Russian defense budget, it's pretty telling. The media releases show Russia massively ramping up its war effort and military production, but the official defense budgets have been a little more sedate. Russia's current officially declared defense spending target for 2023 is about 5 trillion rubles. And I'm deliberately using rubles here because the conversion rate between rubles and US dollars has jumped around more than a kangaroo on Red Bull over the last couple of years, so I'm trying to keep the numbers comparable. On one hand, that meant defense spending in the federal budget would be larger than spending on areas like the national economy, education, or healthcare, and that also meant that in percentage terms, defense spending was increasing faster than any other category except for internal security. But with a double-digit official percentage of inflation and something like a 50% currency devaluation since its peak, those figures might be a nominal increase, but they're not exactly raising the roof. The Russian budget also notes the country's firm determination to fight and win the long war in Ukraine by projecting decreases in defence expenditure in both 2024 and 2025. In fact, by 2025, official internal security spending would overtake national defence. Because nothing says we consider NATO and Ukraine existential threats to our survival, quite like spending more on police and internal security than on the military. Now, when I last discussed these issues, I talked about just how little sense these budget figures make. 5 trillion rubles is a significant increase from 2021 levels of about 3.5 trillion officially, and if you take the SIPRI estimates, about 5 trillion once you hold all of the other elements together. There are also undisclosed elements here in 2023 as well, I'm sure. But an additional 1.5 trillion rubles, or about 15 or 16 billion US dollars at current exchange rates, isn't exactly the kind of money to fund a massive all-out industrial military mobilization. I also can't imagine the US Treasury in 1942 predicting a fall in defense spending in 43 and 44. The US Navy wasn't going to be able to build 100 aircraft carriers using the money it found in the back of a couch. Talking about Russia, there's a simple reality here that Ukraine is also experiencing. Fighting a war is expensive, and a lot of that budget increase would likely be consumed by things like salaries and operational costs. In order to help make up the numbers, Russia has mobilized personnel and called for additional volunteers to increase the size of its regular ground forces. And at the same time that it's been increasing headcount, it's also been massively increasing salaries. Whereas a pre-full-scale invasion conscript might receive a stipend of less than $100 per month, a mobilized motor rifleman in the Russian army can now expect to receive something like 200,000 rubles a month, close to $2,000 US at current exchange rates. These payments help attract and keep people in uniform, but it also now means that new junior enlisted personnel might be earning more than pre-war officers, assuming of course they actually end up receiving that pay as opposed to it being diverted into someone else's bank account somewhere along the line. So officially, Russia is saying that they are significantly increasing military headcount while also paying those that serve considerably more. So right off the bat, you'd expect a significant share of that budget increase to just go to paying these sort of salaries. And then there's the huge variety of operational costs. Food, support services, transport, fuel, all the things that go into running a war machine that aren't building new equipment. And so as a reminder, last time we talked about this issue, one of the points I made were that either increases in Russian defense production were going to be severely capped because of the lack of money in the budget, or the budget was going to have to experience a significant revision. Faced with pressing military requirements and significant currency devaluation, there really isn't any other choice. In 2022, the Russian government did eventually opt to just let the defence budget blow out. The original 2022 budget, passed in 2021, like I talked about earlier, was 3.5 trillion rubles officially. But by September or October, the official figure was 4.7 trillion. There's also some reporting to suggest it probably eventually blew past 5 trillion significantly, despite the relatively strong ruble in 2022, which to me makes the 2023 budget a massive question. If you think about the big headings that go into a defence budget, it's personnel, so things like salaries, it's your operations and maintenance costs, your investments in bases and R&D, and your procurement of new equipment. Compared to 2022, the salaries in the Russian military should be going up significantly, along with payments for troops that are wounded or killed in action. There's lots of talk of new investments in plant material, R&D, etc., so it's unlikely that area is being significantly cut. In terms of operations and maintenance, fighting a war is very intensive, so you wouldn't expect those costs to come down. And then you have Putin saying that they're going to increase procurement 2.7 times over. All coupled with the fact that the ruble is devaluing, and even Russian official estimates of inflation this year are relatively high. So what we're being told is there is a massive increase in expenditure and effort across most of the major categories and a general increase in costs, and yet the overall budget in real terms may well be falling. Secret spending might band-aid that problem, but only so far. I am not a forensic accountant, but something doesn't quite add up there. A cynic might suggest that for propaganda purposes, projecting very large increases in production or salaries is a good thing, but also projecting low deficits and spending is also a good thing. And when propaganda A doesn't talk to propaganda B, you get a situation like this one. But if we leave the cynicism aside, what does the budget actually suggest as it stands now, before any upward revision or blowout? Noting I personally suspect that it will blow out significantly. As it stands now, this is a wartime budget that essentially looks like it's treading water. It looks, especially if you factor in the possibility of secret expenditure, that there should be money here for some moderate increases in defence production in a number of categories. But it's not consistent with something like an across-the-board 3 times increase in defence procurement, let alone all the secondary investments that would be needed to get productive capacity up to the level where those sort of production figures were possible. Even a very significant budget overrun might not get you there. And so when you look at the official budget and compare it to the claims we saw earlier, you start wanting to hit press X to doubt. But of course, a lot of data around what the state specifically does with defence spending and how much money goes into the state defence order is very much classified. But what if instead of trying to work out how much money is being spent on new equipment, we instead look at less classified sources on how much money is being made by the firms that produce that equipment? Namely, the annual reports and published figures by major defence corporations like Rostec. I've always found this somewhat strange because the Russian state defence order, which you can think of as their military's shopping list for lack of a better term, is tightly classified. Whereas the Americans will put out very detailed information almost on exactly how many missiles of a given type they're aiming to procure in a given year. Russia basically gives you the middle finger and forces you to stare into the void and leave you wondering how on earth they managed to afford the maintenance on their nuclear arsenal. But then their national defence mega corporation that produces a huge share of all of their equipment goes and releases statistics on the size of the order they received and what sort of equipment they produced and sometimes in what quantities. This might be because corporations like Rostec feel a need to build domestic and international credibility by releasing information. But it's also kind of like putting landmines in your front yard, deadbolts on your front door, but then always just leaving the window in your backyard open. So here are some gem pieces of data according to Rostec's website. A majority of system types used in Ukraine by Russia are produced by Rostec. In 2022, Rostec reports that they missed the targets in the state defence order, but only by 0.5%. They increased investments over 2021 levels by 20%, and its revenue in 2022 grew to 2.12 trillion rubles, up from 2.06 trillion in 2021. Account for inflationary and cost-driving factors, Rostec self-reports, for example, a 17.2% increase in salaries, and it's very hard to square those figures with any sort of massive increase in defence output. It was similar in 2022 talking about staffing levels. Rostec self-reported 592,000 employees, and Rostec CEO Sergei Chemezov is reported to say that the current situation would require them to hire another 23,000. That sounds like a lot of people, and it is, but it's less than a 5% increase over their current self-reported establishment. There's also an interesting snippet that claims that Rostec's production in 2022 was about 45% civilian and 55% military. That's only a 1 percentage point swing from the ratio in the previous year, and if you read the transcript of Chmezov reporting to Putin, it's actually quite funny, because at least to me reading it, it seemed like Putin constantly wanted to talk about the need for more weapons. He specifically mentioned things like Lancet, for example, but Chmezov spends most of his time talking about what are mostly civilian products. I do not think you should read too much into that. Rostec obviously very much emphasizes its role in filling the state defense order, but I did find it funny. And using that 55-45 ratio, we can come up with a critical figure. You take that figure and apply it to what they said about their revenue, and you get a Rostec military revenue of 1.174 trillion rubles for the year 2022. And that number matters because of the line I've highlighted on your screen there. In a different interview, but also in relation to the 2022 annual report, Chmezov is quoted as saying, "If we talk about the overall volume of state defense orders, then we produce half." End quote. Now that makes sense given Rostec's dominant position in the market, but as a statement it is also hilarious. There is a lot of secrecy around the state defense order. What you basically have here is a bloke who should know what the answer is, saying that X might be classified, but X divided by 2 is approximately 1.16 trillion rubles. If that figure is anywhere close to accurate, it represents an approach to official secrecy that relies on foreign analysts not being able to master the complicated process of multiplying a number by 2. Now, of course, he's obviously speaking very generally. He may be lying, there may be exceptions, and we can also presume that part of Rostec's military revenue doesn't relate to the state defense order at all, but rather to foreign military sales, even if those fell significantly in 2022 and 2023. But it provides a sort of soft cap on the size of the Russian state defense order, at least as it relates to military products, and suggests there probably wasn't a massive increase in defense production, at least in 2022, which is the period these figures cover. In the middle of 2022, Deputy Prime Minister Borisov, who I've talked about a lot before, said that Russian defense industrial corporations employed about 2 million people. He then anticipated that to meet the requirements in 2023, the industry would need to grow its employment by about 400,000 people, a 20% increase. Now, to me, those figures raise a question. If you increase your workforce by about 20% and you assume that newly hired workers are just as productive as all of your old experienced workers, which is a pretty generous assumption, but let's make it for a moment, and then you factor in whatever sort of general productivity increase per employee you see as a result of increasing scale, for example, Rostec helpfully gave us a figure of this of 2.5%, then you end up with a production output increase of about 23%. The question I have here is how are you meant to get from 23% to almost tripling production? Yes, workers are probably working harder and being encouraged to do so, but there's a big difference between Rostec saying there's been a 2.5% increase in productivity per person or a 17% increase in wages, and the 100+% increase in productivity you'd need to make those numbers work. These Russian figures all seem to suggest significant but still moderate increases of defense production in 2022 and 2023, not a return to Russia being able to spam new tank production like it's the Soviet Union of the 1980s. Because as far as we've seen so far, no one is paying for them, no one is being paid for them, and there's no one to build them. I almost imagine Medvedev as an influencer telling the camera that his business is worth billions, while in the background his accountant just sort of nervously shakes his head to the camera. But there's still one other Russian data source that we can cross-reference against, specifically Rostat's industrial indices. These are figures put out by Rostat, so keep that in mind when you're gauging their reliability, that measure manufacturing output over time in various sectors. I believe these indexes use values from a chosen reference year in an attempt to control for inflation, so what they're really trying to measure here is output. To grossly oversimplify it, if the number for a given year is 110, then that should mean 10% more stuff is being produced in a given category than in the reference year. So if the Russian war economy has been roaring to life, then in the relevant categories we should expect to see an awful lot of line go up. So what, might you ask, did the data say when Rostat updated it to the end of Q2 2023? Overall industrial output, according to the index, increased by 2.6 percentage points from the equivalent period in 2022. Which does sound like a reasonable uptick until you remember that the index also showed Russian manufacturing have a pretty hard time of it in 2022. Now the big asterisk here is that obviously not all industries are having an equivalent time of it. During a war and with a rising defense budget, you'd probably expect firms that are selling military equipment to crank up the volumes. It's kind of like trying to sell fireworks in America right before 4th of July. Sometimes you just have to give the people what they want. If you look at the category for fabricated metal products, except machinery and equipment for example, that's reportedly where you'll find things like artillery shells. That category actually showed the index falling by about 10 percentage points in 2022 versus 2021, before climbing again in 2023 to about 18 percentage points above its 2021 value. That's arguably consistent with a significant increase in the production of things like artillery shells, but not some of the higher end estimates. Artillery shells are pretty cheap, so I can imagine you, for example, doubling production output in that area, while still being consistent with these sort of numbers, especially if some other parts of that particular category may have gone backwards. But there is a limit. Unless Rostec is lying to undersell Russian manufacturing activity, then unless all other manufacturing in that category is in a state of absolute calamity, then you can't square that figure with claims that Russia is producing anywhere near enough artillery ammunition to meet their 2022 consumption rates. The reason I mention civilian production, and the reason this sort of analysis needs to be done with a great deal of caution and with acknowledged uncertainty, is because when dealing with these figures, there's no way to just separate out the military production from the civilian. The civilian issue is pretty simple. The index for a particular area of manufacturing is presented as a whole. We might know whether Russia is producing more or less computers in total, for example, but we don't know whether those are going to the school library or being installed in a war machine. Now, I'm not sure what exactly Russian primary school students would do with a ballistic computer, for example, but hopefully you take the point. If civilian capacity is converted to or replaced by military capacity, then as far as the index is concerned, it all evens out. What it does do, however, is allow us to construct a sort of fuzzy, very soft ceiling for Russian defense industrial output. For example, if you presume that Russian defense manufacturing was 20% of all manufacturing output, and the index basically stays static, as it has, then the maximum possible increase in defense output would be 5 times over, and that's only if every civilian manufacturing industry in Russia had gone out of business, and the Russian police were now going house to house, apartment to apartment, confiscating welding torches from retirees to make sure that they didn't accidentally produce an unauthorized metal product and mess with the index. Given these index figures, it's impossible for Russian defense production to have gone to the moon without the civilian economy contracting in its place. And in at least some categories, manufacturing buses for example, Rostec is telling us that that is exactly not what is happening. As it stands, here's what I would very tentatively take away from this data. Firstly, 2022 was not a very good year for Russian defense production or production in general. Perhaps there were still some leaders who thought the thing might be over quickly and that a full mobilization of industry probably wouldn't be required. But the 2023 figures suggest that Russia is starting to make real gains potentially. Overall manufacturing activity is mostly static, but we are seeing significant, if moderate, gains in many militarily relevant categories. Taken together, I'd suggest that a lot of Russian data paints a pretty confusing picture when you compare it with, for example, Russian data. The recent results on those industrial indices and the potential for things like overruns in the defense budget this year all suggest to me that Russia is taking the idea of defense mobilization this year quite seriously. More money is being spent, more shifts are being worked, more investment is being made into the sector. We know all of that. And so we are seeing evidence of things like significant increases in artillery shell production, even if those increases so far are probably nowhere near to meeting Russian requirements. But there are absolutely limits. You can't look at this Russian data in any rational way, I'd suggest, and use it to support claims like Russia producing 1,500 new T-90M tanks per year, for example, which is a claim I've seen. Putin's stated 2.7 time increase in overall defense production doesn't seem to square particularly well with the data we've got, particularly the budget and the industrial indices. And I'd go further and suggest it might indicate that Russia is nowhere near producing the amount of materiel that you would expect a country to need and consume in a conflict of this type and scale. Now, given that Russia hasn't yet run out of many critical types of materiel, we've got to solve a problem. How might Russia be replacing immense amounts of equipment and ammunition without spending that much more money or producing that much more new stuff? Now, there are different theories that you can bring to bear here. For example, Russia might be diverting equipment that was intended from export for domestic use instead. That would mean no increase in production, but an increase in domestically available equipment. It also might mean significant frustration if you're a country like India, for example, and expect to be waiting on your outstanding Russian imports for a very long time. But then again, if Russia was prioritizing international opinion and friendships, it would probably stop doing the whole invasion thing. There are a range of options around data definitions being wonky or simple mistakes being made, but if I was to point to what I suspect is one of the major factors, and it is only a suspicion, I'd suggest the answer is reactivation of equipment from reserve. This is a way you might be able to add active equipment without it showing up on any of those pesky economic statistics. If you go into an artillery storage yard and bring out 1,000 pieces that after testing seem to work maybe okay, good enough sort of, then that's not going to appear as a cost on the defence budget, it's not going to appear as revenue for Rostec, it's not even going to appear as industrial output. Now, public figures might call it output, but it's questionable as to whether it should really be called that. It'd be like going to your fridge, grabbing a bottle and saying that you have produced one beer. Yes, you now have a beer in your hand that you didn't before, but you haven't made it, it's come from somewhere else in your inventory, somewhere else on your balance sheet. And that's both the blessing and the curse of this sort of equipment reactivation strategy. It might be cheaper, faster, and easier than building brand new vehicles from scratch. But it comes with 3 big problems. Firstly, assuming you start with the low-hanging fruit and stuff that runs pretty well, it's going to get more difficult over time. As you dig deeper and deeper, you're going to less and less be dealing with stuff that is basically in working condition, maybe a little rough around the edges, and more towards stuff where Conscriptovich stole the wiring and there are pigeons nesting in the autoloader. Secondly, the stuff is probably going to be pretty old and not as good as the stuff you're building brand new. And thirdly, it's inherently finite. Eventually those yards are going to empty and you're going to run out of stuff to restore. But if you're taking most of the Russian data as inherently accurate and reliable and you're trying to make it all reconcile with each other, my best suggestion would be that repairs, modernizations, and reactivations are being treated the same way as new production output. In essence, I'm suggesting a lot of the time we're not seeing Russian production, we're seeing Soviet production come out of hibernation. Now, if for some bizarre reason you don't trust the Russian government to be entirely honest when it comes to sensitive military information like production figures, then instead we can try and base our assessment not so much on what we're told as what we see. Think of this as the point where we finished interviewing the suspect and going through their financial records and emails. Now it's time to visit the crime scene. The basic approach here being to see what is appearing in the hands of Russian units in Ukraine that we can visually identify, and also what's showing up in the visually confirmed open source loss data over time. Basically, we're going to work out what the Russians are building based on what the Ukrainians are blowing up. There are obviously a couple of assumptions that are going to sit behind that kind of methodology. The first is that, contrary to some of the claims out there, Russia doesn't actually have all of the equipment it could possibly want. If you're bolting 1950s naval guns to the top of MTLBs and talking publicly about how important new production is, then I'm comfortable assuming you don't have as many modern weapon systems as you would like. That leads into assumption 2, which is that if Russia did have a large supply of new or restored modern equipment, it would likely be issued and used. And that in turn, since it's being used, we would see it on Ukrainian and Russian drone footage, Russian propaganda footage, and showing up in the loss statistics. In other words, if Russia had actually delivered 200 brand new T-90M tanks in one delivery alone to their proxies in the Donbass, then on the assumption that this is not some new model fitted with an optical cloaking device, we would expect to get some footage of those tanks over time, as well as see them being hit or destroyed. Okay, so if those assumptions generally held true and there is a correlation between the equipment we see used and being lost in Ukraine and what is actually being produced or restored, then what might we expect to see if different claims about Russian production figures were true? In very simple terms, if Russia was producing more modern equipment than it was losing, then what we would expect to see is the Russian force modernizing over time. As more of the old stuff was destroyed and more of the new stuff arrived, you'd expect to see the Russian army almost improving in real time. At the other extreme, if Russia wasn't producing any modern equipment, you'd expect the modern equipment to slowly disappear as it was destroyed, and only old stuff to be available. Then there's a middle position that I predicted, I think back in 2022, that production of modern equipment continues but isn't sufficient, and so you still see a constant flow of new equipment appearing in loss data, but middling quality systems that are no longer in production slowly disappearing to be replaced by older and older systems that have to be pulled out of storage. Now, whenever someone does analysis like this, there's always one objection that gets raised, and that is the seemingly immortal idea that Russia simply isn't sending its best equipment. That it's sending Conscriptovich and his colleagues to go eat a javelin and a T-62 on the assumption the Ukrainians will eventually run out of javelins and then the T-90Ms can roll. The reason that idea is so attractive to some pro-Russian commentators, despite the flagrant disregard for the lives of the troops involved, is that it allows you to claim that Russia is producing and has a huge amount of modern equipment, even though we don't see it. All I'll say is that I first addressed that question back in early 2022, and as far as the data available seems to suggest, the idea isn't true and never has been. That analysis of early war visually confirmed loss data showed that higher-end vehicles were actually overrepresented in Russian losses. Turns out if you're trying to win a war, it doesn't make sense to send your valuable pre-war regulars into battle in shit equipment, get them killed, so you can issue the good stuff to conscripts and recalled reservists later on. In this war, when Russia has good equipment, we've seen them use it. So if those are the stats from early 2022, what are we seeing now in September 2023? Starting with the Russian tank fleet, what you're looking at here is visually confirmed loss data from War Spotting, which is a visually confirmed loss database, an analogue to Oryx if you will, albeit with slightly stricter acceptance standards around individual losses, and which, critically for this analysis, attempts to attach a date of a loss to each individual recorded vehicle. And what I've done here is clumped together several months at a time of loss data in order to smooth things out somewhat, and split those Russian tank losses by type. And what it shows is pretty dramatic. At the start of the war, 71% of Russian tank losses were some type of T-72. In the most recent period, that number had decreased to 36%. The share of losses made up of older stuff like 55, 62s and 64s has roughly doubled from the earliest part of the war. But the real story here is the rising importance of the T-80 series, which has gone from being less than a quarter of losses between February and July 2022 to more than 50% between May and August 2023. That would suggest that as a lot of T-72s are being lost or new units are put together, they're not being replaced by other T-72s, they're being replaced by T-80s. And that can't be the result of new production from scratch, because Russia hasn't produced a new T-80 hull since 1991. Now, as to why the T-80 is taking over, there's lots of potential theories out there and very few definitive answers. It could be a genuine tactical preference for some reason. The T-80 was the blingy tank of the Soviet era, and critically, unlike T-72 and T-90, it can reverse faster than a walking infantryman. Like seriously, T-72 and T-90 do something like 5 kilometers an hour in reverse from memory, which is, I imagine, a bit slower than most tank crews would like to be able to move if they spot something that is about to try and kill them. It could be that even though there are far more T-72s that are meant to be in storage than there are T-80s, the T-80s are in better condition or there's more capacity to restore them, and as a result they're getting put into action first. There's many theories available and precious little evidence applicable, so I'll try and avoid speculation. But there is one thing I'm pretty confident saying about the T-80s that are being brought into service. Overwhelmingly, they are not new production or ultra-modernised models. What I've done here is split up T-80 losses by their subclasses over those same time brackets. The T-80 BVMs at the top there, those are the modern and up-to-date ones. First revealed in 2017, it's got a lot of the bling you'd expect from an upgrade package of that era. It included enhanced relic explosive reactive armour and the Sosna U gunner sight. That's the one that reportedly included a French thermal imager, if you've forgotten. T-80U, by comparison, doesn't have any of that bling and is the middling option. This is a 1980s model that also got some new guided missiles in the very early 1990s, but one of the key points with the U model was the improved protection, which was better, it must be said, than the T-80BV model. And the BV in turn was better than the absolute cash converters version of modern T-80s, the T-80B from the late 1970s. If given a choice, I can't imagine any sane Russian tanker choosing a T-80B or BV over the BVM. There might be places it's cool to be a little bit retro, but it's probably not the battlefield. And yet, what we're seeing here is that in February to April 2022, the T-80Bs and BVs accounted for less than a quarter of T-80 losses, and in recent months, it's more than 80%. At the same time, the share of losses made up of T-80 BVM has basically held the same through most of the war, while it's the T-80Us, those tanks in the middle, that have more or less gone extinct. What that data seems to suggest to me is that there are T-80s going through modernisation to BVM standard. That's enabling the model to maintain its share of the overall fleet despite suffering losses. Meanwhile, with no new T-80Us being produced or converted, the type is going extinct, while most of the T-80s we are now seeing in Russian service are most likely vehicles pulled from storage, the older models, the Bs and the BVs, that they are reactivating and sending into service without waiting for BVM standard modification. That suggests a need to make up heavy losses quickly and a bottleneck around upgrade capacity. But just because we're seeing a lot of reactivated garbage doesn't mean we're not also seeing some new production. In terms of new Russian tank production, the focus isn't on T-14 Armata, it's on T-90M. Deliveries of the M model have only been going on for a couple of years at this point, but you can see evidence of them happening on screen there. In the early stages of the war, most T-90s that were being lost were older models, T-90As. Cut to May-August 2023, and the T-90As seem to have magically disappeared, and we're overwhelmingly now looking at T-90Ms. So while I think the evidence suggests that Russia is producing nowhere near as many T-90Ms as some commentators claim, they are producing them, and we are seeing them. Now, just in case tank losses represented some sort of anomaly, I also looked at some of the main types of infantry fighting vehicle. This is important because more infantry fighting vehicles have been lost than tanks on both sides. At time of recording, the Oryx estimate for Russian IFE losses, for example, is north of a casual 2,700. Now, the three tracked IFEs I wanted to look at are BMP-1, BMP-2, and BMP-3. BMP-3, as the number suggests, is by far the most modern of the three designs and was the only one in production pre-war. BMP-2 was the most numerous in service in February 2022 and was essentially the mainline vehicle. There were meant to be more than 1,000 in storage, there was an upgrade package and program available, but there were no new build BMP-2s coming online. And then there was BMP-1, a truly revolutionary vehicle, at least when it first entered service in the mid-1960s. BMP-1 was largely being phased out of service on account of it being a bit shit, but the Soviet legacy did include north of 7,000 of the things reportedly in storage. So if the Russia is producing massive amounts of stuff thesis was true, what we'd expect to see is the BMP-3 make up more and more of the force over time. While if the Russia is producing nothing thesis was true, the BMP-3 would disappear and the BMP-1s and 2s would take over. Instead, what we've seen is the BMP-3 has largely hung in there. 23% of losses in the first month, 14% in May to July 2022, and still at 16% in May-August 2023. Given the fact we know visually confirmed losses are occurring, that does suggest new production BMP-3s being delivered. However, the BMP-2 share of the force has decreased significantly, from 65% of losses in the war's opening month, and indeed 65% in August to October 2022, down to 40% in May-August 2023. And indeed, in recent months, we're seeing more Russian BMP-1s lost than BMP-2s. Now, if Russian industry and reserves could effortlessly keep pace with their current losses, we wouldn't expect to see that. We'd expect to be seeing more BMP-2s reactivated from storage without any need to go dip into the BMP-1s. But we are seeing BMP-1s pushed into service by the hundreds and potentially thousands, often forced into speed dating with anti-tank munitions young enough to be their children or grandchildren. The key here is that when it comes to Russian armoured vehicles, more production doesn't necessarily mean enough production. I've seen reports, for example, of Russian defence companies scaling up their number of employees by anything from 10 to more than 100%. But if the absolute peak rate of estimated BMP-3 production in any pre-2022 year was just north of 200, then even if you double, triple, quadruple that figure, it's not going to come close to replacing the vehicles that are visually confirmed lost, let alone those that are destroyed without reported photographic evidence, or those that simply break down or wear out. You might be able to cover the losses to the BMP-3 fleet itself, but the evidence in front of us suggests that there is nowhere near enough new model BMP-3s being produced to cover for the four-figure quantity of 1s and 2s that are being lost. The almost mind-melting scale of equipment consumption here also manifests in the depletion of equipment from Russian storage depots. It's these legacies left by the Soviet Union that are helping Russia cover the gap between production and consumption. I've talked about depots and these figures before, but let me give just one example to illustrate the scale. Earlier this year, YouTuber Covert Cabal looked at a number of Russian artillery storage depots. And across those depots, he counted a reduction in towed artillery in storage from about 12,000 pieces to 7,500, roughly a 5,000 drop. But simply because of image availability, some of the images used in that exercise were a bit older. As a result, he recorded Russia's largest single towed artillery depot dropping from 4,740 pieces before the invasion to 3,400 pieces in August 2022. I was curious to see whether that trend continued, so I did the only reasonable and rational thing and paid to task a satellite to take an up-to-date image of that location. Now, analysing the smudges you see in imagery is always difficult, but it seemed to suggest that an additional 1,500 pieces of equipment had been removed from that depot, between August 2022 and July 2023. Now, not only would that mean that by July Russia had removed roughly half of the visible pieces from their artillery storage yards, it also highlights the scale of the production problem here. There are still thousands of pieces in storage and the possibility of potentially getting more from nations like North Korea. But no country on Earth is equipped to produce artillery systems and replacement barrels at the rate that they appear to be being consumed. Russia had an enormous stockpile of artillery in storage, but unless they are pulling them out of storage only to hide them in a cave somewhere as part of a massive prank, the evidence suggests they are going to run out eventually. But hey, what if the situation with armoured vehicles or artillery pieces is somehow unique? What if instead we look for a moment at something like aircraft? And here, analysing the ratio between new production and losses for a lot of these platforms actually becomes incredibly simple. If you try and calculate a ratio between losses and new production for a number of these aircraft types, you're going to make your calculator very, very angry with you. Because the machine spirits don't take kindly to people trying to divide things by zero. Some of this stuff has been out of production for 3 decades or more. The final new build MiG-31 airframes came off the production line in 1994. For the Sukhoi 24s, it was 1993. The Tupolev 95, the famous bear, 1993 again. And so whenever an aircraft like the Tupolev 22M pictured has a bad encounter with something like a cardboard attack drone, the loss is quite literally irreplaceable and has been since 1993. There is some capacity across different types for new engines or spare parts to be built or for service life extension programs to be carried out, but in a lot of cases where these old Soviet airframes are destroyed or irrevocably worn out, that's it. As a side note, it's a similar situation with the landing ship Minsk that was recently destroyed in dry dock in Crimea by a Storm Shadow strike. The Minsk, ironically enough, was born in Gdansk, Poland, and somehow I doubt the Poles are in a hurry to send the Russians a replacement anytime soon. At least one that isn't packing 1,000 tons of high explosive in storage waiting for the moment it can sail into a Russian dry dock. Just thought that was an interesting aside, let's get back to the planes. And when you are talking about Russia's most modern frontline aircraft that are still in production, the production figures historically have been fairly modest. Pro-Russian commentators often put a lot of focus on Russia's ability to compete with Western countries in certain equipment categories. Russia does, for example, produce a lot of artillery shells. But when you're talking about combat aircraft or air-launched cruise missiles or similar, it's not even close. According to Military Balance, between 2014 and 2021, Russia increased the number of operational Sukhoi 34s from 40 to 124. The number of Sukhoi 35s increased from 25 to 97. If you want a comparison for those figures, Lockheed Martin is targeting to produce 156 F-35s in 2025. They've also reportedly said that with additional resources, that figure could be pushed hypothetically as high as 220. Now, Russian media has reported that the Air Force received new shipments of Sukhoi 34s in, I believe, June of this year and November or December last year. But in neither case, as far as I can tell, do they specify how many aircraft were in the batch. Meanwhile, 21 Sukhoi 34s are visually confirmed lost, while the readiness rates of those that remain is very much unknown. If you're looking for a general takeaway here, it's that Russia is nowhere near running out of aircraft in the near or medium term. But at the same time, the production capacity simply isn't there for the VKS to meaningfully expand. While a lot of the older frames that are in service or in storage represent a very large pool of resources that are very, very valuable, quite extensive, but at the same time, ultimately, pretty much irreplaceable. Honestly, I suspect the driving factor there is often going to be less combat losses to Ukrainian action, and more just simple wear and tear and the erosion of readiness rates as a result of constant wartime operation. The key takeaway here is that what we're seeing from Russian equipment utilization and loss patterns is that they are taking military production seriously. We are seeing new missiles, new aircraft, new infantry fighting vehicles and new tanks appearing on the front line, apparently fresh from the factory. Yes, some of those tanks will ultimately end up joining the turret toss competition as many have before. But things like T-90M are dangerous, capable vehicles that can make life very difficult for Ukrainian units that will often be under-equipped or equipped with older or inferior equipment by comparison. The fact that we are not seeing systems like BMP-3 or T-90M become noticeably rarer despite observed losses suggests that the Russians are succeeding in increasing production above pre-invasion levels. Extended shifts, increased budgets, and 7-day work weeks will do that. And I think there needs to be a recognition of all of the efforts the Russians are undertaking to get these production levels up, especially when it often seems like there are not a full suite of equivalent actions being taken in the countries supporting Ukraine. But the big caveat here is that it looks so far as if it is nowhere near enough. I imagine one of the worst nightmares for Ukraine would be if Russia had used its massive stockpiles to buy itself the time it needed to dial up production to a truly scary level. But that would have been strategically sound, and on the best evidence we have available, it clearly hasn't happened. At least not yet, and unless there are serious revisions to the forward estimate for the Russian budget, it may never get there. The newly produced stuff continues to be a small minority of the equipment that the Russians are fielding. It's there, sure, but the only way the Russians are managing to sustain the losses they are sustaining and continue their efforts so far is continuing to reactivate ungodly amounts of Soviet equipment from storage. That fact has some pretty serious implications that we'll discuss a little bit later on. Because first, I want to add a little bit of a caveat to the overall production picture, noting that there is one area where the Russian defense production picture looks a lot rosier than it does with things like tanks or aircraft. It's specifically in the field of small drones and loitering munitions, and it's an area that, if not properly prepared for and countered by Ukraine and its allies, might have a significant impact going forward on how the battlefield evolves. Now, there are a lot of factors that make small drones and loitering munitions different from a defense production perspective, and there's a reason I wanted to separate them out from the other categories. The first is that drones are just so utterly important to the fighting we're seeing in Ukraine, and they're likely to become more so, not less so, over time. That gives them a certain significance. If Russia is able to massively scale up production of MTLB technicals with old naval guns strapped to the top, for example, I don't think anyone is really going to care. At least that is, except for the poor sods that have to drive and crew the damn things. But a 3 or 4 time increase in production of something like Lancet, for example, would probably be very unwelcome from the Ukrainian side. The second thing is that unlike something like tanks, where we're mostly talking about scaling up existing production facilities, a lot of the Russian supply chains and production, especially for the smallest and most affordable drones, is either entirely or at least mostly new. And finally, when you're talking about something like Shahed 136, for example, the importance of imported units and imported components is massively higher than it is for something like new build tanks. Ukraine was probably faster and more flexible in scaling up small drone and loitering munition production in the early war. Ukrainian operators were generally more creative in how they used their drones, developed a range of tactical innovations, and continue to do so to this day. But while the Russian effort was reportedly hampered by things like internal bureaucracy, competition, and corruption, go figure, at a basic level there seems to be a fundamental difference in how Russia has chosen to approach this production problem, and it's entirely possible that it will bear significant fruit. Ukrainian drone and loitering munition production is relatively fragmented. I'll talk more about this when I do an episode on Ukraine or drones specifically, but suffice to say there's still a lot of activity being driven by volunteer organizations or small corporations, whereas the Russian government has chosen to take a top-down approach to trying to improve production of certain key systems. Their plan for their Shahed 136 clone, for example, is just to build a massive factory to invest in capital equipment to get a serious production line rolling, and then reportedly to build something like 6,000 of the things by summer 2025. A report carried in the Washington Post included satellite images of a facility being built in the Republic of Tatarstan. That's reportedly part of a multi-billion-dollar effort by the Russian government to increase its production capacity in this area in cooperation with Iran. Government can be slow and bureaucratic, especially when you're talking about Russia. But government can also throw a lot of central resources at a problem and generate a heck of a lot of scale. And in the end, even thousands of very dedicated volunteers or workers artisanally assembling drone systems are going to struggle against a purpose-built facility with millions of dollars in capital equipment fully applying the lessons of Henry Ford. The Russian approach is unlikely to produce the same dizzying array of designs that the Ukrainian process does. I mean, the Russian government will end up getting any colour it wants as long as it's Shahed 136, but there is at least the potential for this approach to pay massive returns. Russia may not be aiming to make truly massive strides when it comes to a lot of traditional weapon systems, but in relation to what have been some of the most influential weapons of the conflict so far, the ambition certainly seems to be there. Now, in terms of trying to assess whether it's already paying returns, that's difficult. This is Russia, and there's definitely a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. I mean, in some cases, quite literally, this is a screenshot from a recent documentary on Russian state TV about the production of Lancet, for example. And the storeroom is quite literally full of mirrored surfaces for some reason, which gives a distorted perception of how big the room actually is and how many munitions are actually there. But propaganda aside, I think there are serious reasons that Ukraine might be concerned about what Russia might accomplish in this area. In part because, from a supply chain and production perspective, these things are just too bloody easy to build. Where it might take very serious time, investment and training to build up facilities and a workforce capable of producing F-35s or Sukhoi 34s, for example, FPV drones literally fall into the buildable by a bloke in their shed category, and Shahed 136 isn't that far removed. And because these systems are so cheap, even if Russia was being honest with their economic data, you probably wouldn't see them make that big an impact on the industrial indices. Because if you build one less fighter jet but 100,000 additional FPVs, you might end up near neutral from a cost perspective. Another reason that Russia's experience scaling production here as opposed to other areas is likely to be much easier is because you can import just about everything you need at scale, sanctions be damned. You want to build an Iskander ballistic missile? Fine, but you're going to need to find a way around sanctions to get your hands on the necessary components. Now that may be possible, sure, but someone might notice if a random bloke in Armenia is suddenly ordering 300 US-built fiber optic gyroscopes. By contrast, if you want to build a basic entry-level FPV, all you really need to do is call up a company in China, for example, and say that the drone enthusiasts of Russia would very much appreciate a delivery of 50,000, please. If you want to build your own dedicated system, sure, don't order the drones fully assembled, just order the motors and the various inputs and components and then assemble them in Russia. Usually the equipment in question isn't military, it isn't controlled. Some reports on the contents of captured Russian drones indicate the presence of lots of Western manufactured components. But those are often not sensitive technologies and often not subject to export controls beyond the general maxim of don't sell shit to Russia. Lacking that rule, Chinese companies can sell 30,000, 40,000 drone motors to Russia if they so wish, presumably on the assumption that everyone there really wants to get into drone photography. And it's precisely because this whole process is so terrifyingly easy, it means that Russian volunteer organizations have been able to step in while waiting for the government to do so. They, like their Ukrainian equivalents, try to deliver FPV drones to the troops by the hundreds and the thousands. The problem, however, is that while Russia seems to have a plan that extends well beyond reliance on volunteers in the near and far future, efforts among Ukraine's allies to do something equivalent remain very much an open question. Part of the reason I bring all this up is to stress the fact that there's no simple narrative when it comes to defence production and shortages. A story that applies to one system category or one industry doesn't have to apply to others. NATO countries can be straining to find enough artillery ammunition or ground-based air defence systems to provide to Ukraine, while also having massive available stocks of other potentially critical systems. At the same time, Russia can be struggling with long-term production and sustainability in certain areas, but can still very much be building up towards an enhanced threat in others. Which means not only is the future trajectory of the Russian force not set, even if it is generally towards attrition and degradation, it's also just towards change, as new systems emerge to pick up some of the slack left by those that are becoming rarer and less available. Now at this point, someone's probably going to ask a question or two about sanctions, which, depending on who you ask, are often either single-handedly destroying the Russian defence industrial base, or doing absolutely nothing and should be cancelled. The reality I'd suggest is probably somewhere in the middle. On one hand, sanctions very clearly have not stopped the Russians producing new defence materiel. In fact, across some equipment categories, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say there have even been significant production gains likely realised since the full-scale invasion. It's kind of a historical trend that when you massively increase your defence budget and go to war, defence production tends to increase, even if you don't call the war a war. And even if the Russian defence sector has significantly decayed since the days of the Soviet Union, there's still a lot there to be worked with and mobilised. But it misses the point of what sanctions are meant to and are capable of achieving. Sanctions don't so much stop production as force you to spend the time and the money to evade them. They're not so much bullet wounds as mosquito bites. They're going to drive you nuts with a million small cumulative inconveniences. Plus, we do occasionally get reports of some production being halted or supply slowing down due to equipment shortages. And we have seen the emergence of downgraded wartime models of certain pieces of equipment, like tanks, that use usually inferior domestically available components to substitute for imports. In aviation, in rail transport, in energy production, in defence production, name a sector, sanctions are going to be annoying. But given a sufficient supply of rubles, labour and time, the assumption I think has to be that Russian defence industry will continue to find a way. Alright, so what does all of this probably mean for the Russian army and for the war going forward? And here I think the data suggests a couple of tentative conclusions, although none are anywhere near certain. The first is that after more than 18 months of reports, drone footage and visually confirmed losses, I think we can be very, very confident that the consumption and loss of most Russian systems far, far exceeds their ability to build entirely new ones. And if there is some magical supply of 100 plus T90Ms per month or something, then the only place they're being delivered is to internet comment sections, not to Ukraine. As a result of the shortfall between production and consumption, Russia has to look for alternatives. And the two biggest alternatives are foreign supply when you're talking about things like drones or artillery ammunition, and secondly and more importantly, reactivating legacy equipment from storage. And so we're likely to see the continued polarization of parts of the Russian force, particularly things like the artillery and the tank force. There will absolutely be some dangerous and modern stuff there to, for example, show off to the cameras, but when Sergeant Bisepsky starts calling for artillery fire support, there are better than even odds that that fire is going to come from a system designed in the 40s, 50s or 60s. But even if there's a shortage of certain modern equipment, there'll be other substitute systems coming online as well. I would expect the Russian military in the future in Ukraine to have more drones and loitering munitions than it does today, and for those systems to be as good or better than the ones they are currently fielding. Shahed is cheap, Shahed is simple, and Shahed works. And so Ukraine's need for more systems that can affordably deal with these kind of threats to cities or critical infrastructure is going to be acute. So yes, Ukraine is likely to need more complex systems like Patriot and plenty of interceptor missiles, but more Gepards certainly wouldn't go amiss. It's worth saying that not all military inputs, not all pieces of equipment deplete at equal rates. You're going to run out of something first, and if that something is mission critical, that is your point of failure. The Russian military is showing signs of having potential failure points. Tank and artillery storage depots, for example, are very visibly emptying, which means if the intensity is maintained for a significant enough period of time, eventually they're going to run out, and at that point, well, there are no good options left. But the critical words there appear at the end, if the intensity is maintained. If Ukraine isn't able to continue inflicting losses at the same or higher rates, if Ukraine isn't able to do things to force the Russians to engage forces, expend resources, and take those casualties, things like going on the offensive, if Ukraine doesn't have enough equipment, ammunition, long-range missiles, or supplies of its own in order to inflict and drive that attrition, then that runs the risk of the conflict quieting down to a point where defense production in Russia can keep pace. And the war, at least industrially speaking, becomes almost sustainable. So if you're trying to predict the war through the lens of just defense production, I think you're missing the wider picture. Because how long the Russian army can hypothetically keep this up and what the potential breaking point is likely to be depends a lot on the rate of attrition. To illustrate that, let me quickly close out by looking at 4 possible scenarios. 4 broad outcomes where the main variable that changes between them is how much firepower Ukraine receives and as a result how much attrition it's able to inflict on the Russian side. And to do that, I'm going to compare a burn rate of equipment being lost to a rate of equipment being replaced, both from new production and reactivations from storage, on an assumption that those storages would eventually run empty after an arbitrary period of 12 months. I'd like to stress I'm not modelling any particular real piece of equipment here, I'm just demonstrating the concept. In a scenario where the rate of attrition is significantly greater than both new production and the rate at which Russia can repair and reactivate old and damaged equipment, then what you're going to see is the force start to degrade in terms of quality and quantity. Because it doesn't matter if you have a tank storage yard the size of a moon if you can't reactivate them fast enough to keep up with your losses. In this scenario, the army can hypothetically fight on until the difference between attrition and the combination of production and restoration is sufficient to erode away the army's active combat power and leave it combat ineffective. This is one of the reasons Ukraine might be arguing for lots of aid being delivered very, very quickly, rather than that same amount of aid being spread over multiple years. If you want to sprint down your opponent's combat power in this sort of way, you need a lot of equipment, and you need it now. If the rate of attrition is greater than the rate of production, but less than the combination of production and restoration, well, then you're looking at a second scenario. One where the force can continue to fight until it can no longer restore equipment, which is what happens when you run out of easily restored equipment in storage. Because in this scenario you need to burn through not just all of the active equipment and what's able to be restored in time, but instead you need to burn through all of the equipment in storage plus everything produced during that time, then all else equal, you'd probably expect this scenario to require more aid to Ukraine, just delivered over a longer period of time, and as a result, a longer war. And even if you expect to start putting Russia in deep equipment deficits in 2024 or 2025, that only works if enough aid is arriving on your side to keep up that intensity. In that scenario, you probably don't need to be asking where Ukraine is getting its next 30 tanks or 20 howitzers from, but instead what the plan is for the next 500 tanks, 1,500 IFVs, or 1,000 artillery pieces. Then there's a third option, which is just depressing for everyone involved. In this scenario, the intensity isn't maintained or increased, but instead drops over time. This is what we might expect to happen if, for example, Ukraine was cut off from all supply of weaponry from its Western allies. If that caused Russian attrition to drop below the rate not just of restoration but also of new production, then all else being equal, you'd actually expect the Russian army's equipment to improve in quantity and quality over time. And if the war remained one of attrition, then the bottleneck is going to become something like financial resources as opposed to defense industrial production. In other words, the war will continue as long as there are rubles available to pay for it. And given the financial resources available to the Russian government, let alone Ukraine's various European, American, and Oceanic allies, that could be a very, very, very long time. It's important to stress the data suggests this isn't the path that we're currently on, because as I've demonstrated, I think it's pretty clear that losses far exceed the rate of new Russian production at this point. It's also possible that the war ends due to a failure of political will as opposed to a failure of military and financial resources. But hey, look, I come at this from a defense economics perspective, so let's just pretend people are zombies for a moment. The core point is that militaries are delicate machines that require all sorts of complex inputs. Russia almost certainly doesn't have the production capacity to make up for its losses in some of those critical areas. But where critical shortages emerge first, what the impact is, and when they occur, are all likely to be driven by a myriad of other factors, including the combat power of the Ukrainian military. I'd suggest the numbers involved indicate it's possible for the West to give Ukraine enough equipment to win a war of hardware attrition. But it is also far from a given. From a political perspective, for a lot of leaders, that's probably a pretty inconvenient answer. If Ukraine was already more than powerful enough to outlast and defeat Russia, then there wouldn't be any need for additional aid packages. Alternatively, if Ukraine was so horribly outmatched in defense production and conventional capability that victory was ultimately impossible, then it might be argued that there was no point to additional aid packages. But in a scenario where we can see Russian storages emptying in real time, where it's obvious that Russian defense production isn't up to the levels required to meet current attrition levels, then the impetus is absolutely there. In conclusion, the available evidence suggests that Russia was pretty slow to mobilize additional defense production output in 2022, at least in terms of new-built equipment. The data in 2023, however, does suggest some increases in output and efforts to increase it further going forward alongside some increase in budget allowances. Despite sanctions, the evidence we have suggests that Russian defense production in some of the examined categories, things like artillery ammunition, missiles, drones, tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles, is all increasing despite sanction pressures. That said, observed battlefield fielding and loss data, Russian industrial indices, and also the Russian budget all place an upper ceiling on our estimates for Russian defense production, and as a result, all of those estimates realistically are far below the rate of general material consumption and attrition. That means that all else being equal, we should expect to see the quality of equipment in the Russian force continue to polarize and Russian stockpiles continue to run down. Some systems, like drones and loitering munitions, may become available in ever greater numbers and pose serious challenges to the Ukrainians. But if the Ukrainians are given the resources they need to maintain or increase the level of intensity while maintaining their own endurance, then unless something dramatic changes, there is an upper limit on how long Russian stockpiles will last. How long that is in significant part a function of how much attrition the Ukrainians can inflict and whether or not they can maintain the fight. And it's with that in mind that I'll make sure to revisit the topic of Ukrainian aid, production and endurance in the near future. The final observation might be that the West continues to have the financial and industrial resources to overpower Russian production if it chooses to do so. The key point, as ever, seems to remain a question of will. Russia and Ukraine have both demonstrated significant willingness to mobilise their defence industrial resources. Time will tell the extent to which Ukraine's allies are willing to do the same. Okay, channel update to close out, and I'm very happy to say we're getting close to the point where I will no longer be living out of a suitcase, at least for a while. For you, hopefully that means slightly improved sound quality, and for me, hopefully some more room to breathe. In terms of today's episode, I consider it a sort of back to basics for the channel, interrogating data and looking at the big picture. This sort of data diving can take a while to prepare, but at the same time I think it's sometimes where I can add value. Of course, as I stressed today, looking at Russia is only half of this attritional equation. So we will do a video on the Ukrainian and Allied side of this equation in the future, most probably once we know what's going to happen with proposed US aid to Ukraine in the coming year. As it is, that's meant to expire at the end of September, so a vote should be incoming. Finally, for the patrons, expect a couple of updates in the coming days and a new topic poll to cover upcoming content, but just be warned I may need a few days to get over jet lag and similar. Thank you to all of you, as always, for your tremendous engagement and support, and I'll see you all again next week.